Welcome, everybody. This is truly a joy. And I want to thank Susan, obviously, Margaret, the Grand Lodge here of California. I want to thank my presenters and to all of the Masons, both who participate directly in the Grand Lodge, but all the other Masons whose efforts and time and money have somehow made it here. I thank all of you very, very much. And by the way, dinner last night was excellent. And so to kind of build off of Susan's segue, I will talk about scholarship, current writings, and approaches. I won't necessarily do it all in this particular order. So for example, the issue of different approaches to thinking about Masonry is in many ways diffused throughout my talk, but I certainly will begin first with scholarship and then talking about current writing. And so, let's see here, hopefully I get it right.
Yes.
All right, it worked. Excellent. So, a few things here. The title, Prince Hall Freemasonry, is lowercase, and perhaps I was being too cute here. But I wanted people to look at that and say, well, why is it lowercase? And so the response is that, for those of you who might not be familiar, even though Prince Hall Freemasonry, uppercase, all words, is in some ways delineated, right, with this qualification, Prince Hall. It is, in fact, a normalized and fully legitimate form of Freemasonry here in North America. But for reasons of racial prejudice and a very complicated history, you do have Freemasons that identify their lodges with this descriptor, Prince Hall, even though, in fact, they are of the same origination. And I won't talk a lot about it here, but there's wonderful recent work by Prince Hall Freemasons that talks about the complexity of the expansion of their lodges and tensions between state lodges and a national Grand Lodge, even amongst people of African descent. Really, really interesting stuff. A lot of drama and arguments, but also consensus and a lot of interesting characters. So in terms of the things that you see up here, to the far right is the front page of David Walker's Appeal, who I'll talk a bit more about. And then here you see this piece, Am I Not a Man and a Brother? So Hosea Wedgwood in 1787, as a part of abolition in Britain, created this image, which becomes a very prominent image for abolitionists in Great Britain and in the United States at the end of the 18th century. And so it was used to gain sympathy on behalf of people who were against slavery. And it was actually a very powerful image. But at the same time, we see this person of African descent kneeling in supplication, in deference. And again, that was used to gain sympathy. But I think the story of Prince Hall Freemasonry in some ways suggests an alternative aspect to this image. Prince Hall Freemasons, African Americans who joined Masonic lodges and who were deeply involved in the abolitionist movement, were not just deferential. They didn't kneel, they demanded rights. And they demanded rights as citizens of a new nation, and they demanded universal rights as members of a cosmopolitan lodge that had reached across the Atlantic. Down here is you can't read it well, but it's a newspaper clipping that mentions Prince Hall and his son, Primus Halls, from a mid-19th century African-American newspaper. Over here is a depiction, this was from the 19th century, of Crispus Attucks, one of the first people of African and Native descent who was killed in the lead up to the Revolutionary War in Massachusetts, the Boston Massacre. And up here you have this document from the microfilm held at the Massachusetts Grand Lodge and also by the African Lodge 459 in Dorchester, Massachusetts. And this, even though you can't make it out here, and even if I had the original, it's still difficult to make out. But I have this document here. It's very important because it highlights those initial 15 African Americans who eventually created African Lodge number 1. And then you have in Copp's Hill Burying Ground, which is on the north section of Boston, the tombstone for Prince Hall. Copp's Hill was initially created in the 17th century, and it was kind of an active burial ground up until the mid-19th century. Over 10,000 Bostonians were buried there, and Prince Hall and approximately 1,000 other African Americans were also buried there. So all of these images in some way represent and frame my talk today. And so I was initially drawn to the study of Prince Hall after reading Dr. Charles H. Wesley's excellent biography of Prince Hall. This classic work thoroughly addresses important questions about Prince Hall, the founder of the first acknowledged Black Lodge, his broader significance, and his lasting impact. Yet, despite Wesley's thoroughly researched argument for the historical importance of Prince Hall, and despite the vast literature on the founding of African American voluntary associations, there has been relatively little exploration of African Americans within Freemasonry, especially by academic historians. For example, African Americans like Richard Allen, the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first formally separate Black Christian church in the United States, and others like James Forten, a prominent Philadelphian in the late 18th, early 19th century, and Paul Cuffey, a fairly famous African American sailor. These people have gained far more note in much of the scholarship than people like Prince Hall. And so Prince Hall is very much a founder of African American society in America, even though others have gained much more attention from American historians. And so this lack of recognition is particularly striking, given that the founding of African Lodge number 1, which becomes African Lodge 459, that it predates the formation of the AME Church by at least 2 decades. And so academic scholars have previously viewed Black Freemasonry as a small and opaque institution that developed outside the mainstream of African American life and that had little relationship to broader issues in American history. And so despite the excellent work of Masonic scholars, and given the lack of attention by academic scholars, important questions persist about the first 2 generations of Freemasonry. And Prince Hall and David Walker, in many ways, bracket these first 2 generations. Who were the first Black Freemasons? Why did Freemasonry appeal to them? How did they practice Freemasonry? How did they and their peers shape Northern gradual emancipation? And how did Black Freemasonry illustrate problems and possibilities for community leadership and politics? And so this is, in effect, my first reveal. It is an argument to reveal Prince Hall Freemasonry to academic historians, to make them see its importance beyond a kind of interesting voluntary association that stands on the sidelines of American history. So today, one of my arguments, my primary argument, is understanding how, or at least my argument is to introduce you to understanding how and why Prince Hall Freemasonry developed during its first 2 generations, and to talk a little bit about why academic historians should be interested in this. And to talk briefly about how these first Black Freemasons shaped debates about American freedom and citizenship. And so most of my time will be spent on discussing Black Freemasonry's significance in Massachusetts during the Revolutionary era, and then I'll end with a brief discussion that traces a line of its political activism from Prince Hall to David Walker. And David Walker is the writer of the famous Walker's Appeal in 4 articles, together with a preamble to the Colored Citizens of the world, but in particular and very expressly to those of the United States of America. Yes, that's a mouthful. And while academic scholars acknowledge the importance of charting political activism from Hall to Walker, they have in fact done little to explore the political dimensions of this timeline using Prince Hall Freemasonry really as the strand. And so here, in terms of review of the literature, we have William Grimshaw, and he writes this history of African Americans in Freemasonry. And it's very interesting because many Masonic scholars, Prince Hall scholars and Masonic scholars in general, have called William Grimshaw out. So for example, one of the things that Grimshaw writes is that Prince Hall came from Barbados. But in fact, there is no evidence of that. And certainly Grimshaw is writing in the early 20th century, doesn't have access to the multiple sources that historians writing even in the 60s and 70s had. And so Masonic historians take Grimshaw to task, but I think it's important to recognize the significance of his work and work that follows, despite the fact that there are significant historical inaccuracies. And so if we move from Grimshaw, we get Martin Robinson Delaney, and not a lot of time has been spent with this work. Historians and political scientists think of Martin Delaney as within the trajectory of the development of Black nationalism. At one point, he's interested in migrating back to Africa, but very little time is spent on his ideas about Freemasonry. I'm including him here because I think he's important in thinking about a whole literature that's written by and about African American Freemasons and people interested in African American Freemasonry. These are more recent works. Charles Wesley, who I mentioned, Joseph Waltz Jr. started the Phylaxis Society, and then Harry Davis. All of these are really important works, and there are other more recent works. John Hairston, Alton G. Roundtree, and Stephen M. Baptista have all written really interesting work. In addition, you have work by people like James R. Morgan III and Mark Tabbitt that in various ways talk about Prince Hall Freemasonry. And all of this work, I think, has served a critically important function, certainly for Masons, but for all of us. The work done by Prince Hall Freemasons has expanded democratic discourse in America by making the basic but powerful argument that people of African descent can and should participate fully in American democracy and civic life via shared membership in voluntary institutions. And I think this is a really important point because one way to critique some of this scholarship is to say, well, they got some of their facts wrong. And for somebody like Grimshaw, that might be true, but in terms of a broader significance, they are making arguments about the legitimacy of African Americans to participate in this voluntary association. I think that's a very powerful argument. And so beyond the things that they get right and the things that they get wrong, beyond, in some ways, their insular interests with genealogy and ritual, they are trying to create a space within American history, within Masonic history, that really pushes an argument for universalism, cosmopolitanism, and equality. So I want to highlight that and say that I owe a debt to some of this earlier work. More recent work, and here's where I'm kind of bringing in different scholarly approaches. Corey Walker, Joanna Brooks, John Salient, and John Ernst have all written about Prince Hall Freemasonry from kind of religious studies approaches or literary critical or literary historical approaches. So there is current work and there is current interest. And I'm trying to kind of build upon that going forward. Here you have work by historians, and up in the right-hand corner, Theda Skocpol, a sociologist at Harvard. So some really useful and interesting stuff going on here. So I want to move from this brief bit about lit reviews to talking more about, in some ways, the meat of my presentation. And so during the American War of Rebellion, Prince Hall emerged as a distinct leader and an important public voice. But several other Freemasons were also leaders. In fact, as a group of Freemasons of African descent, as a group, Freemasons of African descent stand out during the Revolutionary era. On January 6, 1773, a person of African descent wrote an anti-slavery petition to the General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Province. This first letter was signed Felix, and it is likely that he had help from whites in writing and sending the letter. In this missive, Felix explained, quote, "We have no property, we have no wives, no children, we have no city, no country." 4 months later, Felix sent another petition, and this time he included his last name, Holbrook. Historians have already emphasized the importance of these critiques, and I've also talked about these petitions in particular. However, these petitions are useful for us because they help us follow the relationship between activism and Black Masonry. Following the second petition came at least 5 other petitions that we know of. Felix Holbrook was not a Freemason. However, the second petition, dated April 20th, 1773, not only included the signature of Felix Holbrook, but also of Peter Bestes. Bestes later became one of the original 15 initiates into the First African Lodge. Holbrook disappears from the public record, except for a brief mention of, quote, Felix Holbrook, a Black, end quote, being admitted to the Boston almshouse in 1792. Of the 8 petitioners to a January 1777 anti-slavery petition, 4 of them, in fact, were Black Masons who, along with Prince Hall, had become Freemasons in 1775. And that date, 1775, I acknowledge that John Hairston argues the date should be 1777. And here I'm reminded, Susan, of your earlier comments about dates. And I had a conversation with a Freemason about this issue of dates and what would happen if I made the argument that 1778 was the date. And the response was as well, they have whole days devoted to this particular date. And I thought, whoa, I don't know if I'm going to touch this one. But I had a very good conversation with John Hairston, and I could certainly talk more about this issue of dates. I won't spend time with it now, but I do want to acknowledge that there's perhaps controversy about that 1775 date. So of the 8 signers to a January 1777 anti-slavery petition, 4 of them were Black Masons. Peter Bestes helped draft this 1777 petition sometime before dying in June 20th, 1778, and we know his death date because it's in the Lodge records for African Lodge, which becomes number 459. Brister Slenzer was also one of the original 15 and a signer of the January 1777 appeal. Lancaster Hill became a Freemason sometime after 1775, but also signed this January 1777 petition. And by June 23rd, 1779, Lancaster Hill had attained the degree of master and had become treasurer of the African Lodge. And so the most important of this first generation, Prince Hall, also signed, obviously, the 1777 petition. The language of the petitions moved from conciliatory critique to sarcastic demand. The language of the 1777 petition expressed the impatience of earlier petitions and became more explicit in its critique of colonial hypocrisy. Addressing the Massachusetts General Court, Hall and the other writers noted sarcastically, quote, "Your Honor need not to be informed that a life of slavery like that of your petitioners, quote, who were, quote, deprived of every social privilege, of everything requisite to render life tolerable, end quote, represented a circumstance, quote, far worse than non-existence. The sarcasm differed markedly from the deferential tone of previous appeals. And so this, in some ways, leads me to my second reveal, the first being, making the argument to academic historians that Prince Hall Freemasonry is worthy of more study. And the second is one of method. So I initially gained interest in Prince Hall Freemasonry, as I noted earlier, because everybody talked about Freemasonry, but there's no sustained analysis outside of the work done by Masonic scholars. And so my advisor said, well, I know about this guy. I don't know a lot about him. You go out into the archives and find more out about his biography. Well, I went looking, and I hate to admit that I didn't find a whole lot new. I didn't find any evidence that Prince Hall was born in Barbados, for example. And so I said, let me take a different strategy here. So I spent over a year and a half in Boston with books that looked like these, and these are basically tax records from the late 18th century. And so I essentially read all of these different tax records. And why did I read these tax records? Well, I thought, if I can't necessarily find anything new, any smoking guns relative to Prince Hall's biography, perhaps I can find out more about the community in which he lived, and use him as kind of a focal point for understanding Prince Hall's world. And by understanding Prince Hall's world, perhaps that would also then lead me to understanding more about the world of African American Freemasons. And so not only do tax records partially illuminate Prince Hall's social worlds in Boston, they also reveal the competing significance of locality and mobility in shaping his political and fraternal outlooks. A careful compilation of Boston's tax records from 1780 to 1801 reveals at least 1,100 different individuals identified as persons of color under the descriptions of Black, Negro, and Mulatto. Between 1780 and 1801, assessors identified the Masonic Hall for 15 years in that time span. Authorities listed the Masonic Prince Hall as a leather dresser, as a Freemason, as worshipful Grand Master, as Master Mason, as the Black Freemason, and Master of Lodge. And so here, in fact, you see an image from a taking book from 1800, and I'm going to try the pointer at the risk of turning the whole thing off. Oh, success. All right, so let's see here. Here you can see James Lower, and he's designated as Black, and this number indicates that he was a Pole. In other words, he could be taxed according to Boston's legal guidelines at the time. And then here you see that he's a servant to this entry up here, and we go over here, and we see Thomas and George Payne, and they were doing okay. And so we move forward here. Oh, sorry, you know what? There's another thing that I want to highlight on this, and it is here, very small, gone. You see this a lot in these records, and this is part of one of the kind of sub-arguments I'm making today. And so here again, you see Jack Williams, and he's listed as Black. And so it's certainly the case that, oh, and then down here, you see the same thing, and then here, and then, in fact, you see in some cases where these people were living. What you don't see in these particular images are the wards. So Boston was divided into 12 wards over the period that I looked at, and the boundaries of those wards change, but relatively to small degree. And so these records demonstrate that Black people were constantly on the move within the small port city of Boston. Black mobility shaped Hall's politics and his relationship to Freemasonry. We have no evidence that Hall arrived to Boston from another place or that he left Boston once rooted there. However, that Hall would gain initiation into a fraternity with international reputation and reach, that he considered the feasibility of leaving North America in 1787, and that his reputation attracted the black preacher John Morant to Boston demonstrated Hall's astute worldliness. In 1784, Hall, after maintaining a correspondence with English Freemasons and relying upon both black and white seamen, conveyed a request to the Grand Lodge of London for a charter that would formally recognize the African Lodge. Again, utilizing a network of sailors, Hall received the official document in 1787. Hall recognized that Boston's black community was and had to be migratory, and that his leadership depended on developing local but also transatlantic networks of affiliation. Hall's social worlds led his way into Freemasonry, and Freemasonry shaped his activism. Sometime after the end of the war, the Revolutionary War, and after Massachusetts had ended slavery, the esteemed white Reverend Jeremy Belknap acknowledged Hall's authority and asked his thoughts regarding emancipation in Massachusetts. According to Belknap, Hall explained, quote, "Harmony in a great measure prevails between us as citizens, for the good law of the land does oblige everyone to live peaceably with all his fellow citizens, let them be black or white, for," and here's a reveal, "we stand on a level, therefore no preeminence can be claimed on either side," end quote. The Masonic metaphor of standing, quote, on a level stands out in Hall's language. This seemingly minor and inconsequential phrase shows that the universalism espoused within Freemasonry meant more to Hall than just a rhetoric of equality. Hall deployed the metaphors and idioms of Freemasonry in explaining everyday life. Belknap remembered that Hall further explained, quote, "There's here a great number of worthy good men and good citizens that are not ashamed to take an African by the hand," end quote. However, Hall also demurred, quote, "But yet there are to be seen the weeds of pride, envy, tyranny, and scorn in this garden of peace, liberty, and equality," end quote. By the 1780s, in Massachusetts, black people were gaining freedom. Men of African descent could join the African Lodge, and they even gained the vote. However, this did not mean that free black people were easily accepted as citizens. Abolition had gained significant momentum in Massachusetts, but its results were uncertain, if not contradictory. For Prince Hall, the ambiguities of freedom demanded pragmatic politics. On November 26, 1786, Hall wrote to the governor of Massachusetts, James Bowdoin, pledging the support of black Masons to any state-supported efforts against Shays' Rebellion. This was an insurrection of poor farmers in western Massachusetts, led by Daniel Shays, who was a veteran soldier of the American Revolution, who in fact had fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill. 1787 marked the year when Hall and approximately 72 others applied to the Massachusetts General Court with a plan to emigrate to Africa. And in the same year, Hall and 34 other men wrote to the Boston Selectmen to garner support for the education of black youth. And this document, the top of the document is cut off, but I included the bottom half of the document. And here you can see Prince Hall's name here. William Gregory was also a member of the lodge at the time. There are other members of the lodge who are in this list, and the list continues here. And so, as we're reading these documents as artifacts, the fact that many of these individuals were able to sign their names is really useful evidence for us, because many people who weren't literate just signed with an X. So for somebody to be able to sign with their name demonstrates a degree of literacy, which is important, especially when we're thinking about learning Freemasonry, learning its rites and its rituals. And so, hopefully I've made it clear that Hall was a very important leader. And I think with his death in 1807, we had the passing of this first generation of the African Lodge. And so if Hall is symbolic of a first generation of African American Freemasons, then David Walker, despite his untimely death in 1830, was the most public voice of Black Freemasonry's second generation. Scholars have noted Walker's membership in the African Lodge. However, they have not written a history of African American Freemasonry that begins with Hall and leads to Walker. Walker's time in Boston, approximately only 6 years, was short but deeply and broadly impactful. According to his biographer, Peter Hinks, Walker reached Boston from Charleston, South Carolina, no later than 1824. However, Walker, as I mentioned, died soon after. The causes of his death are not completely verified, but his biographer contends that he probably died of natural causes. A 19th century source dated Walker's birth to September 28th, 1785 in Wilmington, North Carolina. Walker arrives to Boston as a young adult from South Carolina. And so there are two different portrayals of Walker's significance. His biographer, Peter Hinks, argues that Walker, arriving from the South, radicalizes the North. In contrast, comparative contrast, another historian, Patrick Rail, argues that it's really the infrastructure of the North, including the African Lodge, that provides Walker with the ability and the tools to amplify his political voice. And so I argue that these are really two interpretations of the same coin, complementary more than conflicting. And so Walker arrives to Boston as a free literate person and soon established himself as a used clothing dealer, a business that was becoming increasingly lucrative, and that was thought to reflect some degree of respectability amongst African Americans in the city at the time. Walker then joins the African Lodge and the semi-independent Black Methodist May Street Church. His biographer noted that the clothing trade and Freemasonry provided Walker with many of his most important Boston relationships. And so in addition, Walker, along with the Reverend Thomas Paul, served as the Boston agents for the distribution of America's first Black newspaper, Freedom's Journal. In 1805, Thomas Paul founded Boston's first Black church, the African Baptist Church, and Paul also entered the African Lodge and served as its chaplain sometime before 1821, when records describe his chaplaincy and his becoming a Master Mason. In 1827, Peter Williams Jr. led an array of Black people in New York to found Freedom's Journal, and David Walker, in fact, served as an agent for Freedom's Journal, Boston's agent for that first Black newspaper. So given Walker's initiation into African Lodge, it's likely that he read the three published texts that first articulated ideas of Freemasonry as understood by people of African descent, and these texts were published in the 1780s and the 1790s by Prince Hall, in fact. The writing from John Morant, who became a Freemason upon his arrival in Boston, and Prince Hall argued that the founding of the African Lodge in Boston was providential and that it served a kind of sacred history, whereas the earliest Freemasons were biblical hewers of stone who not only lived in Africa, and this was key for them, locating Freemasonry within Africa, because this also meant that they were locating people of African descent within a longer lineage of builders that led up to the current lodge. And so these proof texts of 18th century Prince Hall Freemasonry, I haven't put them up here, but I'm talking about them, emphasized Christianity, benevolence, literacy, and Enlightenment ideas of universal brotherhood. And so a concern for education and the emphatic featuring of Black intelligence wove through the writing of Prince Hall and David Walker. Not only Had Walker petitioned for the public funding of schools, and not only had he sought emigration to Africa, but in much of his writing, there's always this emphasis on the intelligence of black people. And so, from an address in 1797 that Hall gave, I quote, Hall, this is from Hall, although you are deprived of the means of education, yet you are not deprived of the means of mediations, by which I mean thinking, hearing things in your own mind, and making that judgment of them as you think reasonable to satisfy your minds and give an answer to those who may ask you a question. So I think implicitly, right, we see this working out of Hall speaking to both non-Masons and Masons of African descent, really encouraging them to try to cultivate their intelligence, even in the lack of formal support for black education at the time. Also, Hall was directly refuting the racist presumption that people of African descent did not have the mental capacity to be Freemasons, to learn and explain the system of symbols, metaphors, and rituals that comprised fundamental Masonic knowledge. Hall further affirmed black intelligence when he wrote, quote, "Let these despisers see, although many of us cannot read, yet by our searches and researches into men and things, we have supplied that defect, and if they will let us, we shall call ourselves a chartered lodge of just and lawful Masons." Hall essentially illustrates that African American Freemasonry was an argument for black equality. Certainly, many African Americans desired literacy. For Freemasons of color, their identity as Masons made education an even greater necessity. And so, like Hall, David Walker, saw education as an urgent requirement, and he expressly dignified the acumen of black people. Although scholars acknowledge that Walker was a Freemason, very little analysis explains how the African Lodge and its tradition of activism might have informed and inspired Walker's politics as expressed in his appeal. And so in his appeal, Walker explained that, quote, "I know well that there are some talents and learning among the colored people of this country which we have not had a chance to develop in consequence of our oppression, but our oppression ought not to hinder us from acquiring all we can," end quote. It seemed that Walker was explaining the responsibility of his Masonic brethren when he also explained, quote, "Men of color who are also of sense, for you particularly is my appeal designed. Our ignorant brethren are not able to penetrate its value. I call upon you, therefore, to cast your eyes upon the wretchedness of my brethren," speaking of the enslaved people in the South, "and to do your utmost to enlighten them. Go to work and enlighten your brethren. Let the Lord see you are doing what you can to rescue them and yourselves from degradation," end quote. And so Walker was fiercely challenging those who questioned black intelligence. On this score, Walker called out Thomas Jefferson, certainly an important founder of American history. In Walker's third edition of his appeal, he wrote, quote, "I advance it therefore as suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance," forgive me if I said Walker, I meant to say Jefferson. Jefferson, in the third edition of his notes on the state of Virginia, wrote, quote, "I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments of both body and mind," end quote. And Jefferson also comments on Phyllis Wheatley. So this is the frontispiece from Wheatley's publication. She was the first person of African descent, the first woman of African descent to publish in the North Atlantic world. She starts out as an enslaved person to the Wheatley family in Boston, but is actually able to gain her freedom in part because of her writing. Thomas Jefferson was sent a copy of her poetry, and he effectively dismissed it, saying that it was the work of a good mimic. And so when we're thinking about African-American Freemasons, right, for somebody as prominent as Thomas Jefferson to call into question the intelligence of Phillis Wheatley directly implies that black people don't have the intellectual acumen to practice Freemasonry properly. So the stakes are quite high, and they lead to, or they help explain why Walker, throughout his appeal, spends so much time refuting the remarks of Thomas Jefferson. Obviously, we take it for granted that people are going to argue for equality, but I do think that David Walker's membership in the lodge made the stakes that much more personal for him. And even though this is a subtle point, it's yet a point that has not been made by scholars who see David Walker in this lineage of political activism without understanding the role that Freemasonry might have played within his outlook. And so Walker continues a tradition amongst African Americans of protesting against slavery and of arguing against this argument that black intelligence is less than, somehow different from and less than white intelligence. And David Walker goes on to use this millennial religious language to excoriate American society and to argue that if Southern slaveholders don't free their enslaved population, that they will suffer the consequences of God's wrath in terms of slave revolt. Walker obviously was not popular in the South, but he inspired a great many people, including African-American women in the North. And so this is a book, there's another recent biography that has come out about Mariah Stewart. She's one of the first African-American women and women in general to speak in public on political issues in the early 19th century. And she talks about being directly inspired, in fact, by David Walker. And so I want to conclude with this Declaration of Independence. And so the highlighting of the creation of an African Grand Lodge in the early 19th century. So you have this Masonic and also political lineage that begins with Prince Hall in 1775 or 1778, and that arrives then to the early 19th century. And so we have to remember that Freedom's Journal, the first African-American newspaper, is formed in 1828. We have, in the early 19th century, this declaration of an African Grand Lodge. And then in also in the late 1820s, we have David Walker giving his appeal. So in terms of the interest of Freemasonry to a broader audience of historians, there's a shift in abolition from an emphasis on it being something gradual to something that is more immediate. And this puts us on the path to the American Civil War. Freemasonry plays a critical role in understanding the history of abolition in American society. And by understanding Freemasonry through the lives, experiences, and expressions of both Prince Hall and David Walker, hopefully we can make the argument for the significance of Freemasonry within these broader histories about American abolition, American politics, and American citizenship. Thank you.